Now, we have a number of great scholars, and one of the great ones is a brother named Harold Cruz. For those of you who have read Harold Cruz on your chat, put I have or something like that. Let me see how many people have read it. Um, he wrote a couple of books, the most important of which was The Crisis of the Negro Intellectual. And this book was a classic, and classics are very rare books. And I'll explain why it was a classic in a minute. But on page 327 of The Crisis of the Negro Intellectual, he makes an observation that's very important if we're going to understand why we're in a lot of the crisis we're in, and why we aren't doing as well as we could do economically. It's not the whole reason, because we're up under oppression, which I call semi-colonial. It has aspects of colonialism and systemic racism. We're up under that with vestiges of slavery, and now what I call a choice between two cultures, things that I've gone into before. So we're up under an oppressive system. But to get out from under oppression, then there are a lot of things that we have to do. And on page 327, Crisis of the Negro Intellectual, Harold Cruz points out one of the big roadblocks to Black liberation. Now, it's not the sole one. And not everyone in this group that I'm going to describe shares these characteristics, but the majority do. And so this is his comment. He says, taken as a whole, the Black bourgeoisie, here he's referring to the Black middle class, usually Blacks who have received a college education, some haven't, but usually those that have and have gone through what they call this higher realm of education. Some of them have done well enough economically to be a part of this without having to have a college education, athletes, business people, some entertainers. But for the most part, the Black bourgeoisie is a part of a class of people also called the Black middle class. Now, bourgeoisie can also mean people who run and control an economy. And that's generally how you would describe some of those who run the capitalist system, for example. But generally, it's referring to this middle class group. So he says, taken as a whole, the Black bourgeoisie in the United States is the most politically backward of all colored bourgeoisie classes in the non-Western world. Now, this is pretty serious because he's saying more backward than in Africa, more backward than in the Caribbean, more backward than anywhere else we are in the world. It is a class, he says, that accepts the philosophy of whites, whether radical, liberal, progressive, or conservative, without alteration or dissent, and calls it leadership. Clarence Thomas would be an example of someone who has taken on the extreme of right-wing thought. Some people have called him a conservative. He's actually to the extreme right of the Supreme Court. He's not a conservative, extreme right, which means that he has a great amount of contempt for himself and his people. And so he's an example of that. And then you have Blacks who are in the bourgeoisie who are radical, who take on, say, the philosophies of Marxism or something else without applying it to their own culture. Ho Chi Minh can call from Vietnam, who led the liberation struggle in Vietnam, a Marxist, but he was a nationalist first. He embraced Marxism because he agreed with Lenin, who was the leader in the Russian Revolution that took over for a period of time after the fall of the Kerensky government, which was an attempt at some kind of, I don't know what, democracy or whatever. And he had formulated the idea that in colonies where people of color are oppressed, then what you needed was a united front for liberation. So in the colonies, he said that the various groupings of people, in Vietnam, it would have been Buddhists, some Catholics, farmers, various sectors of the people needed to have a front, a united front to fight the colonizers, to fight the French, the Japanese, and then the Americans. So Ho Chi Minh embraced Marxism because he agreed with what Lenin said. He wasn't following Lenin. And by the way, Ho Chi Minh was inspired by Marcus Garvey, who said Africa for the Africans, Asia for the Asian, and Europe for the European. And I pointed this out before. He was working on a French steamship line. They stopped in New York. He went to a Garvey meeting. He heard that. And then he said, I started to think, what am I doing here working for the French? I need to go back and help liberate my people from the French. And that's what he told Kwame Ture, Stokely Carmichael, before, when he went to Vietnam, told him to get his black ass and go to Africa and aid in the liberation of Africa. But it took a black man to prick his consciousness, so I think he was already pretty well awake. But he could take on a form of Marxism that suited his nationalism. His nationalism guided that. So he came from the intellectual class. He was a Confucian scholar. He was, and that's not a bad thing, because the Confucian system has got a high emphasis on ethics. When he died, you could put all his possessions in a duffel bag. He refused to live in the palace of the French when he took over North Vietnam. He lived in the servants' quarters. He was a humble man and wise and smart. They called him Uncle Ho. So he brought in his own creative ideas, and he could say under the rubric of Marxism. But here's the deal. Ho Chi Minh aligned with the Russians because he said he needed one white power to fight another one. In other words, he needed the rockets, the missiles, and the weaponry that came from the Russians to shoot down the planes that came from the French, or that came from the Americans or the Japanese, and to shoot them. You understand? But he thought for himself. He had his own ideas. And the first thing he thought was the love of his people. That was the first thing. So blacks in this country have had trouble with that, because usually when they tried to even marry Marxism with nationalism, the Marxism played the leading role in this and took them off into some funny directions. But there was some interesting efforts to synthesize the two among some. They came out of the group called the Revolutionary Action Movement, RAM, for example, in the 60s. They produced some pretty brilliant people, but I don't think they got much out of Marxism. I really don't, you know? This point he's making, that the black bourgeoisie in the United States is one of the most politically backward of the colored bourgeoisies in the non-Western world. He's not only including Africans, because it accepts the philosophy of whites, whether radicals. So in this particular case, without alteration. And that's because of an alienation from their own people and their own culture. And then the same thing with the liberal, the black liberal, who ends up becoming more Democrat than the Democrats, you know? I could think of a number, and some of them good people, most of them probably, but no sense of originality. John Lewis would fall into this category, and I think that he's a good man. I respect him, but he's frozen in 1965. he didn't go beyond 65. He didn't go where King went, around the human rights challenge and everything else. His heroes became Bobby Kennedy and John Kennedy and Martin Luther King. He had a lot of respect for King, but he didn't undergo the growth that King underwent. Part of the reason is he didn't do his homework. You know what I mean? He didn't do his homework. And so he was a liberal, and liberalism is itself a funny doctrine. I was watching Bill Maher. He was on CNN, and he was complaining, the good old white liberal who's saying, I don't know why I get criticized by, he's implying blacks. I'm on their side. Really? He said he didn't support reparations. He said the reason was he didn't do it. That boy's worth $140 million. I checked out his bank account. You know what I mean? $140 million. You mean you ain't willing to give up a penny of that? And do you realize you got it, through free labor without that as a comic, which I think it's obscene that, and he's pretty good comic. You know what I mean? Better than most of the political thinkers in the white world, better, but he's still a liberal. You know what I mean? The liberals got a problem. And so he's going to tell us he's on our side, but we're telling him, really? You know what I mean? Really? Huh? Meaning you're on our side as long as we side with you. That ain't how it works. So liberal, too many blacks who are coming out of this black bourgeoisie can proclaim their liberalness, which is better than a conservative, you could say. But in the end, they're constricted and limited or progressive. So his first point is, this black bourgeoisie takes on the philosophies of others without alteration, without even thinking about it. And then he goes on to make this observation. Referring to the black bourgeoisie, he said it is a class that absorbs very little from the few thinkers it has produced. Martin R. Delaney, W.B. Du Bois, Booker T. Washington, E. Franklin Fraser, Carter G. Woodson, men who left something behind them. Now, there are many more than that list. I'm not going to go through the list. There's many more, men and women. But his point is that we produce some creative intellectuals. This black bourgeoisie, in large part, doesn't even look at their thoughts, doesn't draw an iota from them. So he goes on to say, it is the one non-white bourgeoisie class in the world that fears to express its own legitimate nationalism, waiting on the benevolent nod from the power structure before it moves to achieve its limited social aims, because it refuses to be assertive about its Afro-American heritage. This class fails to be revolutionary on any social front in the United States, not even in civil rights, and often fails to even be progressive or even be liberal. And too often it's talking loud and saying nothing, or can talk some real heavy talk when things get heavy from the grassroots, and the grassroots starts to move. So they'll make a lot of talk, but there's no walk behind the talk. And that's the group called the Black Establishment. That's a whole nother discussion. That's a control group of major Black institutions, major Black leaders that work in alignment with the whites who rule this country to keep us under containment. So this is a serious charge, that the bankruptcy of the large part of the black bourgeoisie is its failure to shape a philosophy that is grounded in its best thought. And its best thought would come out of the deepest thought of its people that express a love for themselves. and an urge and desire for its liberation. And so it fails to touch on that because it doesn't want to offend old master. You hear me? But I would go further. I would say that it's not only that the Black bourgeoisie has failed to address its best thinkers in the US, I would say that it has also failed to draw from the best thinking of our African heritage. It's failed to draw from the best thinking of the philosophy of Africa, the political systems of Africa, the social systems of Africa, the economic systems, and the spiritual systems, and generally the culture of Africa. And so it finds itself in an amnesiac position where the only thing that it's good at quoting is white people. And it's not even good at that because it's very often not giving much thought to it. It's behaving like most whites who are in power, being pragmatic and doing whatever you can to make some money, because that's basically what this group is concerned about.